Sometimes the biggest battle in football starts long before kickoff. Right now, the loudest argument around the Cleveland Browns isn't about playbooks or preseason reps, it's about belief. Before a full season even unfolds, people have already chosen sides over Shedeur Sanders. Some see a future franchise leader. Others keep searching for literally anyone else. And that's what makes this situation different. Normally, a rookie quarterback earns trust slowly, performance first, opinions later. Here, the opinions arrived before the evaluation even started. Analysts debating replacements, fans arguing timelines, insiders questioning readiness, all before the plan has had time to breathe. Then one insider said the quiet part out loud. This might not be disagreement, it might be narrative. Because once the organization started hinting at its direction, the debate didn't calm down. It actually got louder. Right next section for 500-600 words. The moment the conversation shifted from football to comparisons, everything escalated. On paper, debates about quarterbacks are normal. Teams weigh experience against potential all the time. But the specific names being floated around the Cleveland Browns didn't feel like typical evaluation. Instead of discussing development timelines or scheme fit, the discussion kept jumping to alternatives. Sometimes veterans, sometimes backups, sometimes players who haven't proven they can stabilize a franchise at all. That's where the tension really started building. Because when a team drafts a young quarterback like Shedeur Sanders, the expected process is simple: reps, mistakes, growth, adjustment. Every organization understands that progression. It's how quarterbacks develop timing with receivers, command the huddle, and learn defensive disguises. Growth requires runway. But the outside conversation never stayed on development long enough to matter. Instead, the focus repeatedly returned to replacement scenarios. What if they brought in someone else? What if they pivoted? What if they tried a safer option? The pattern kept repeating before the evaluation even began, and that's what made it stand out. It wasn't criticism after poor performance. It was doubt before opportunity. And when doubt arrives before evidence, people start asking why. Some insiders began suggesting that uncertainty itself had become the story. A clear answer doesn't generate debate. A stable depth chart doesn't fuel daily discussion. But an open-ended quarterback controversy, that lives forever. Every show gets a topic. Every article gets engagement. Every opinion gets reactions. So the narrative never closes, it resets. Meanwhile, inside team environments, quarterback development usually follows structure. Coaches build installs around comfort. Teammates learn cadence and timing. Leadership grows organically through repetition. That process needs consistency more than perfection. Even talented quarterbacks look average when the environment keeps shifting around them. That's why constant speculation can matter more than it seems. When the public conversation keeps suggesting instability, fans perceive instability, even if the locker room doesn't. The perception becomes reality to outsiders. Suddenly, every throw carries extra meaning. Every rep feels like a test instead of a lesson. And development slows because evaluation turns into pressure. The irony is that teams often preach patience publicly, while chaos grows externally. And that disconnect is what fueled the current argument. Some voices insisted the organization's actions suggested a long-term plan. Others kept framing the situation as unresolved. Neither side was technically forbidden. Sports debate thrives on disagreement. But the intensity felt unusual for a player who hasn't even played enough snaps to justify final conclusions. Which brings us to the core question. When a quarterback becomes a daily argument before becoming a weekly performer, is the discussion following football, or is football following the discussion? Because once that line blurs, the conversation stops being about reads, accuracy, or progressions, and starts becoming about attention. And attention, unlike a depth chart, never needs a final answer. Right next section for 500-600 words. Then came the locker room whispers, the part fans almost never see, but players always feel. Quarterbacks don't just learn playbooks, they learn trust. Timing routes depend on receivers believing the ball will arrive before they even turn their heads. Linemen block harder when they know the pocket matters. Veterans rally behind consistency, not constant evaluation. And that's where the ongoing noise around Shedeur Sanders started creating a subtle but important ripple. Because every time a new debate surfaced, the focus shifted from "how do we build around him?" to "are we still building around him?" That difference sounds small, but inside a team it's massive. Players pay attention to messaging, not just what coaches say privately, but what the organization allows publicly. If teammates hear weekly speculation about replacements, it signals uncertainty, and uncertainty affects behavior. Receivers press to make bigger plays. Running backs hesitate on option reads. Even captains avoid fully endorsing leadership until the direction feels permanent. Reports never directly stated a divide, but observers noted something interesting. Teammates supported the quarterback individually, yet public confidence sounded cautious. No dramatic criticism, no open rejection, just careful wording. The kind athletes use when they don't want to step into management decisions. And that cautious tone only fueled discussion further, because fans interpreted neutrality as doubt. At the same time, comparisons kept resurfacing. Analysts brought up stability models, veteran insurance options, and hypothetical competitions. Normally, those conversations happen in off-season projections. Here, they persisted daily, and repetition turns possibility into perceived probability. But here's the twist. Young quarterbacks often improve the most when the team publicly commits before results justify it. Confidence from the organization precedes confidence from the roster. Leadership is granted before it's proven, not after. Without that, development becomes conditional. And conditional leadership rarely works at quarterback. Around the Cleveland Browns, the messaging never clearly collapsed, yet it never fully locked in either. The team didn't bench him, didn't demote him, didn't shut the door, but also didn't completely silence alternatives. So the story lived in the middle ground. Not failure, not endorsement, just constant evaluation. That middle ground is the hardest environment for a young passer. Because mistakes stop being learning moments and start being evidence in a larger argument. A missed throw isn't just a missed throw anymore. It becomes a data point in a debate already waiting to happen. And once a player feels every snap is part of a public trial, instinct changes. Instead of reacting, he calculates. Instead of playing, he protects. Ironically, the pressure to prove readiness can delay readiness. Some observers began suggesting the cycle was feeding itself. The more uncertainty discussed, the more pressure created. The more pressure created, the slower development appeared. The slower development appeared, the louder the uncertainty became. A loop with no clear starting point. But what really caught attention wasn't just performance talk, it was timing. The intensity of debate didn't spike after bad stretches. It existed before extended opportunity. That's what made the situation unusual compared to typical quarterback growth curves. Which raises a bigger question than depth charts or stats. Can a quarterback establish authority while still being treated like a temporary option? Because if leadership depends on belief, and belief never stabilizes, progress may never look convincing, no matter the talent. And what unfolded next would push that tension even further into the spotlight. The public debate was loud, but the internal timeline was quieter and far more revealing. Organizations usually follow a predictable rhythm with young quarterbacks: draft, protect, simplify, then gradually expand responsibility. But around Cleveland Browns, observers started noticing the rhythm felt interrupted. Not completely changed, just never fully settled. One week the offense looked structured to support Shedeur Sanders with quick reads and defined throws. The next week, it leaned toward broader concepts that demanded anticipation chemistry normally built over months. Neither approach was wrong individually. The problem was the constant switching. Young passers rely on repetition to speed up processing. Consistency builds confidence. But when responsibilities subtly shift week to week, evaluation becomes complicated. A difficult concept can look like hesitation. A protection adjustment can look like indecision. From the outside, the difference disappears. All people see is the result. And that's when narratives grow faster than development. Fans began judging performances as finished products instead of ongoing construction. A third down checkdown became lack of aggression. A delayed throw became hesitation. Yet coaches often install those exact decisions early to prevent turnovers while mechanics stabilize. In other words, the same play could be interpreted two completely different ways depending on the story people already believed. Then came the comparison cycle. Every young quarterback eventually gets compared to veterans, but usually after a season's sample size exists. Here, comparisons appeared almost immediately. Analysts debated readiness levels, alternative timelines, and hypothetical upgrades. None confirmed, none official, yet constant enough that each game felt like an audition instead of development. That changes how progress is perceived. Growth at quarterback is rarely linear. There are weeks where processing speeds up dramatically, followed by games that look like regression because defenses adjust. Normally, teams absorb that fluctuation internally. But in this situation, every fluctuation amplified discussion outside the building. And players hear that. Teammates may not respond publicly, yet locker rooms track confidence signals carefully. When conversation always circles back to what-if options, leadership authority becomes temporary by default. A quarterback can call plays, but commanding belief requires organizational certainty. So the real issue wasn't performance alone. It was timing versus expectation. Reports suggested the staff still viewed development as ongoing, while public reaction treated each snap as a verdict. That mismatch created a strange environment. The team teaching long-term mechanics while the outside world demanded immediate conclusions. And that tension reached its peak during critical moments, 2-minute drills, late drives, pressure downs. Instead of simply reacting, every decision carried narrative weight. Success meant validation. Failure meant reinforcement of doubt. No middle ground. Ironically, that environment can slow growth even when talent is present, because instinct depends on freedom. Quarterbacks who fear mistakes start avoiding aggressive reads. Avoiding aggressive reads makes offenses predictable. Predictability then looks like limitation. So the conversation kept looping back to the same point. Evaluation was happening in real time, publicly, every week, something most franchises try to prevent for young passers. But the biggest shift was still ahead. Because once expectations stop being about development and start being about proof, the organization itself faces a choice: fully commit or keep the door open. And the next phase suggested that decision still hadn't been completely settled. The conversation changed the moment alternatives started sounding more realistic than patience. Up to that point, most debates were hypothetical, normal off-season talk, comparisons, projections. But then reports and discussions began circling around other quarterbacks again, and suddenly it wasn't just evaluation anymore. It felt like positioning. Names kept surfacing in discussions connected to the Cleveland Browns, even when those moves didn't logically line up with contracts, draft capital, or roster timing. Analysts would bring up experienced starters, mobile playmakers, or safer options. And each time the same effect happened. Instead of focusing on progress, the spotlight moved to replacement. That shift matters more than people think. Young quarterbacks don't just develop through reps, They develop through trust signals. When teammates, coaches, and front office messaging align, players take risks necessary to grow. But when conversations repeatedly circle back to potential alternatives, every throw begins carrying a hidden consequence. Not just complete or incomplete, but secure or uncertain. And that's where the perception gap widened around Shedeur Sanders. Some viewed the criticism as standard rookie scrutiny. Others saw something different, a moving evaluation bar. Good moments were labeled expected, while mistakes were labeled proof. That imbalance created the feeling that performance alone wouldn't settle the discussion. Then came the locker room factor. Veteran players rarely comment directly, yet their reactions show in subtler ways a post-game tone, sideline energy, communication urgency. Observers notice teammates still rallying, still communicating protections, still engaging during adjustments. That usually signals belief internally even while debate rages externally. Which raised a question. If belief inside remained stable, why did uncertainty outside keep growing? Because off-season planning had quietly entered the conversation. Teams normally shield young quarterbacks from strategic speculation, but draft positioning, cap flexibility, and coaching direction all became public discussion topics. Suddenly, every mock scenario turned into a referendum: build around him or prepare a pivot. Even unrelated roster talk looped back to the quarterback position. That's when media narratives accelerate. Not intentionally malicious, just the nature of constant coverage. Each segment needs a new angle, and the easiest angle is the most important position in sports. So week by week, evaluation transformed into anticipation. Instead of how is he improving, the tone shifted to what will the team decide. And once that shift happens, every performance gets interpreted through future plans instead of present context. A solid game becomes temporary. A bad game becomes predictive. Ironically, development often requires the opposite, reducing stakes so learning can happen without permanent labels. But now stakes were attached to everything. Late-game drives weren't just comeback attempts anymore. They were arguments. Third-down throws weren't just reads. They were evidence. Even play-calling choices were interpreted as confidence indicators from the staff. And that's how a season stops being about football alone and becomes about direction. Because the real tension was whether talent existed. It was whether the organization was ready to close every other door. Until that answer becomes clear, conversation never settles. It just rotates around possibilities. And as the offseason approached, those possibilities were about to get louder, not quieter. Then the debate moved from analysis to identity. At first, it was just commentators arguing about development timelines. But as weeks passed, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders stopped sounding like a normal quarterback evaluation and started sounding personal. Fans weren't just discussing mechanics or reads anymore. They were defending belief systems. One side focused on patience. Young quarterback, new system, unstable offense, growth takes time. The other side focused on urgency. Tough division, expensive roster, short competitive window, production has to come now. Neither argument was unreasonable. But what made it intense was how quickly every performance got filtered through those lenses. A clean drive became proof he's the future. A stalled possession became proof the team needed to pivot. There was no neutral ground left in the middle, and once sports conversations lose the middle, volume replaces perspective. And that's exactly what happened around the Cleveland Browns. Talk shows, podcasts, and clips online began framing weekly results as turning points instead of steps in a process. Instead of gradual progression, every Sunday felt like a final exam. Even small decisions, a checkdown instead of a deep shot, were treated like philosophical statements about his ceiling. But development doesn't usually work like that. Quarterbacks often grow unevenly. One week they read defenses perfectly but miss throws. Another week they throw accurately but react slowly to pressure. The uncomfortable middle stage is messy, and that's the stage most young passers live in before things click. Yet the environment around him didn't allow for messy. Each Monday brought a louder reset of the same question: commit or move on. And repeating that question changes how performances are viewed. Because when audiences expect a verdict, they stop watching for progress. That's when the locker room dynamic quietly became important again. Teammates continued operating as if the plan hadn't changed, protections adjusted, routes extended, communication steady. Those details rarely trend online, but inside football they signal continuity. And continuity usually means the building itself hasn't panicked, even if the outside world has. Which created a strange contrast. Internally, the situation looked like a normal growth phase. Externally, it felt like a franchise crossroads every week. That disconnect fueled more speculation. Analysts tried reading coaching decisions as hidden messages. Fans interpreted silence as confirmation. Every press conference sentence carried more weight than intended because people weren't just listening for answers, they were listening for direction. And direction defines expectations. If the organization signals patience, mistakes become learning moments. If the organization signals urgency, mistakes become warnings. Right now, nobody publicly closed either door. And as long as both possibilities exist, every performance keeps getting interpreted two different ways at the same time. Which means the real decision might not arrive during a game at all. It might arrive when the season ends, when planning replaces reacting, and the team finally shows whether this era is about building around him or building past him. But here, where the conversation quietly shifted again from performance to comparison. Instead of asking whether progress was happening, people started asking a different question: who would you rather have right now? And once that question enters the discussion, development almost stops mattering. Now everything becomes a race against finished products. That's why the constant matchup debates exploded online. Names like Kyler Murray kept getting thrown into the conversation. On the surface, it sounded like a fair football comparison: mobility, arm talent, improvisation. But the timing of it made things complicated. Because comparisons rarely evaluate context. One quarterback has years of NFL adjustments behind him. The other is still learning how fast pro defenses disguise coverage. One has already failed, adapted, and recalibrated. The other is still seeing those lessons for the first time. When you compare those two moments directly, the experienced player almost always looks safer, not necessarily better, just more familiar. And familiarity is comforting to fans. Every incomplete pass then becomes proof the younger option isn't ready, while every highlight throw becomes proof he's special. The middle disappears again. It stops being about trajectory and becomes about immediate certainty, something the NFL rarely gives anyone early. Inside the Cleveland Browns building, though, comparisons don't actually solve problems. Coaches don't prepare for hypothetical quarterbacks. They prepare for the one in the huddle. Protections, timing, route spacing, all of it evolves around repetition with the same player. Resetting that cycle delays progress more than a bad game ever could. But debates outside don't operate on practice schedules. Media discussions thrive on definitive answers, and quarterback development rarely provides them quickly. So the conversation kept looping back to the same dilemma: potential versus certainty. Fans wanted reassurance, analysts wanted conclusions, and neither truly exists mid-development. That's why even neutral topics became charged. A designed rollout became evidence the staff didn't trust pocket reads. A deep shot became evidence they were forcing optimism. Even conservative play calling got interpreted as hidden evaluation rather than normal game management. The narrative grew bigger than the plays themselves. Yet if you zoom out across league history, most successful quarterbacks went through this exact phase, the stage where flashes are obvious but consistency lags behind. The difference is usually patience length. Some franchises wait long enough for the curve to smooth out. Others pivot before the curve finishes forming. And that decision often isn't purely football. Contracts, timelines, roster age, fan pressure, all of it mixes into one organizational choice. When expectations accelerate faster than development, perception turns into urgency. When urgency arrives, every comparison suddenly feels like a solution. Which is why the debate hasn't slowed down. It's no longer just about how he's playing. It's about how long the team is willing to wait. And once that question becomes the main storyline, the next few months stop being about single games and start being about the future direction of the franchise itself. Eventually, every quarterback discussion in Cleveland circles back to the same unavoidable name, Deshaun Watson. Not because of current performance, but because of presence. He's still on the roster. He still carries one of the most significant contracts in the league. And in the NFL, money doesn't just pay players, it shapes perception. Fans naturally assume that a contract of that magnitude must equal a future plan. But front offices don't always operate that way. Sometimes contracts represent commitment. Other times they represent consequence. This one represents consequence. The Cleveland Browns aren't evaluating Watson the way they would a normal quarterback competition. They can't. The financial structure already locked in the past decision. Whether he plays or not doesn't erase the cap impact. Whether he starts or sits doesn't change the accounting. The money has already been spent in the only way that truly matters, against flexibility. That creates a strange public illusion. Because fans see a veteran quarterback still attached to the team and assume he must be part of the active future plan. But roster construction doesn't work like depth charts in video games. A player can exist financially without existing strategically. The Browns don't have to choose between development and contract reality. They have to live with both simultaneously. And that distinction is where confusion grows. Every week speculation resurfaces. Maybe the veteran returns to reclaim the job. Maybe experience wins out. Maybe the organization pivots back to stability. But if you look at organizational behavior instead of assumptions, the pattern says otherwise. Coaching hires, offensive adjustments, and timeline alignment all lean toward a developmental window rather than a reclamation project. That doesn't erase Watson from the equation. It reframes him. Instead of representing the future, he represents the past decision the franchise must carry while building the next phase. His role becomes contingency, insurance, and financial residue all at once. Not irrelevant, but not central either. Fans often struggle with that middle ground because sports conversations prefer clean outcomes. Either a player is the guy or he's gone. Either a contract matters or it doesn't. But in reality, some contracts linger longer than their football purpose. And this is one of those cases. The organization's challenge isn't deciding whether Watson once had talent. That debate is over. The challenge is determining whether continuing to structure the offense around him helps or delays the next competitive window. And when development timelines enter the equation, age becomes unavoidable math. One quarterback is trying to reestablish what he used to be. Another is trying to become what he hasn't been yet. Teams almost always choose the second timeline when both exist together, even if the first timeline costs more money. Because championships are rarely built on recovery arcs, they're built on growth arcs. The difference between those two paths defines roster direction. So the real question isn't whether Watson can play. It's whether building around him moves the franchise forward faster than building beyond him. And judging by the structural decisions surrounding the offense, coaching philosophy, supporting caste emphasis, and developmental language. The answer the Browns appear to be leaning toward isn't about replacing him overnight. It's about outgrowing the need for him altogether, which makes the situation less dramatic than people expect and more final than they realize. Quarterback debates rarely stay confined to talk shows and headlines. Eventually, they seep into the one place they matter most, the locker room. And inside a professional team environment, uncertainty at quarterback doesn't just affect passing charts or play calling. It affects belief. In any NFL building, players don't just follow talent, they follow direction. When teammates know who the organization is investing in, practice habits sharpen. Receivers run routes at full tempo because timing matters. Linemen communicate protections with confidence because cadence becomes predictable. Running backs commit to reads because the offense gains identity. Stability doesn't just help the quarterback, it organizes everyone else. That's why public support from leaders inside the Cleveland Browns matters more than most fans realize. Defensive stars don't casually endorse quarterbacks. They don't gain anything politically from doing it. Their jobs exist on the other side of the ball. When they speak up, it's usually because they've already seen enough behind closed doors to form conviction. In football culture, belief is built during weekday practices long before Sunday performances. Players judge preparation speed, command in the huddle, recovery after mistakes, and communication during pressure periods. Those are things fans never see, but teammates do every day. And once a locker room begins aligning around a developing quarterback, constant external speculation creates friction. Not chaos, not rebellion, friction. It forces players to repeatedly answer questions about hypotheticals instead of focusing on execution. Instead of discussing adjustments or chemistry, they respond to narratives about potential replacements. That matters more than it sounds. Football depends heavily on repetition. Timing routes depend on trust in where the ball will arrive. Protection schemes depend on confidence in who sets protections. Even defensive morale connects to offensive consistency. Defenders play more aggressively when they believe drives won't constantly stall. A stable quarterback environment reduces hesitation across the entire roster. Now flip the scenario. If players constantly hear public debates suggesting the organization might pivot at any moment, subconscious hesitation creeps in. Receivers second-guess depth adjustments. Offensive linemen anticipate different cadences. Coaches simplify schemes to protect uncertainty. Nobody openly panics, but everyone subtly protects themselves from instability. And that slows development. Young quarterbacks don't just grow through playbooks. They grow through repetition with teammates who believe the repetitions matter long-term. If every practice feels temporary, chemistry develops slower. If teammates assume a new starter could appear any week, they don't fully invest in the rhythm. That's why organizational messaging and locker room messaging must match. When leadership signals one direction but outside noise suggests another, players naturally choose the environment they experience daily. If they see preparation, accountability, and progression from one quarterback in practice, their trust follows that path regardless of commentary. But constant public debate still creates distraction cycles, media questions, fan reactions, and weekly speculation loops. Over time, teams that eliminate that loop progress faster than teams that live inside it. Because confidence is cumulative. Each week of consistent leadership builds faster communication. Each game of continuity sharpens decision-making across all positions. By midseason, those small advantages become execution advantages, fewer penalties, cleaner drives, calmer late-game moments. Quarterback stability isn't just about the quarterback. It's about giving the entire roster permission to commit. And when a locker room senses the organization has quietly chosen its developmental direction, players naturally begin organizing themselves around that timeline. Leaders adjust expectations, veterans mentor differently, and younger players attach their growth to the same arc. From the outside, fans see a depth chart. From the inside, players see a trajectory. The team that commits internally before it commits publicly often develops faster than the team still debating possibilities. And once a roster starts aligning behind a timeline, revering that alignment becomes far harder than making the original decision. Which is why the real story isn't just who starts week 1. It's whether the building already knows and is simply waiting for the outside world to catch up. At this point, the conversation isn't really about one player anymore. It's about direction. Every organization eventually reaches a moment where it either commits to a timeline or keeps living in temporary solutions. And once leadership, coaching strategy, and locker room belief begin pointing the same way, the debate naturally shifts from who could start to how the team grows. What we're watching unfold around the Cleveland Browns is less a position battle and more a perception battle. One side follows official signals and long-term development. The other feeds off possibilities and constant alternatives. Both exist in sports, but only one actually builds continuity. History shows franchises stabilize only after they stop searching and start developing. Not because the answer is guaranteed, but because progress requires patience to even measure it. So the real question moving forward isn't whether debate will continue, it always does. It's whether fans trust the noise or trust the direction.